and we're learning today a very interesting subject matter today. It is titled Real Reason Why Nazi Officers Fled to Argentina After World War II.
It's such a juicy topic.
Yeah.
We can't, and I feel like, come on, let's talk about it.
Yeah, not it doesn't get talked about a lot.
Yeah,
So,
it does.
yeah.
The fact that I found this out outside of school blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like we touched, like World War II was talked about maybe what we say, like 2 semesters.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 semesters. I mean, it's a heavy lifting in the school's history curriculum.
It does. Yeah, it's a good majority of it, like enough of it to where it stands out.
Yeah. And this was never talked about.
No.
And
no.
I found this out so much later. I'm like, dude, this is interesting. And I left it at that. And I can't wait to hear what is said about this.
It'll be interesting. It'll get some conversations going in the comments. I know that much.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope, people know that we're talking about history here, guys. History.
Yeah.
History is both good and bad.
Yeah. History is history. You can't change it. Yeah. Before we go in, just want to let y'all know we picked this from a poll that we do every week on Patreon. If you want to be part of that and also get full reactions to TV shows and movies without that pesky text on the screen, patreon.com/embracethesuck21, link down in the description.
Yes.
And if you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and what do you say, Dan?
Be a part of the community, not just the channel. Massive difference. It's a huge difference, guys. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows everyone here.
Exactly. We're a big old family around here in a good way.
Yep. 100%.
Okay. Anyway, you ready to go in, Dan?
Yeah, man. Let's do it.
All right. 3, 2, 1.
Or your parents grow up with a Nazi war criminal living on your street? A dithering old man who was once a ruthless mass murderer in Germany or Poland? After all, some of you out there lived among those war criminals, more of you than you might think. You'll agree with us in about 25 minutes. At the end of April 1945, the smell of Adolf Hitler's smoldering flesh filled the nostrils of the few people who witnessed his ad hoc cremation in the Reich Chancellery Garden. Berlin was in flames. The Red Army was marching in, leaving piles of dead German soldiers and civilians in its wake. The grand prize. Many of the highest-ranking Nazis, the chief executioners, sadistic scientists, and the demented doctors were scurrying from Germany like rats from a house fire, some of them with assistance from the very people they'd been fighting against for 6 years. On April 30th, Hitler said his goodbyes to the 20 or so people in the Führer bunker in Berlin. He had already informed a select group of men of the plan. Burn me until there's nothing left of me. Don't let those Soviets take my body as a trophy. Turn me into ashes, Hitler demanded. Don't leave anything. Still, when Hitler gave that order, he knew there was still a possibility of escape. His private pilot, Hans Bauer, whom Hitler had a very close bond with, had pleaded for his boss to get the hell out of the bunker and fly to freedom. Bauer had been saying this for weeks. Even when the Red Army's shells made Hitler jump every so often, Bauer was still sure he could fly his Führer to safety. In the weeks and days leading up to the end, Bauer's Führer squadron had been ready to leave Germany from at least 6 airfields in and around Berlin. There were many options as to where to go. The Baltic coast, maybe, or further afield, Greenland, Manchuria, Argentina, Japan. Arab sheiks would even help hide Hitler. Hitler wasn't impressed, so Bauer told him again right at the end he had a Fieseler Phi 156 Starch-Light plane waiting. He could take off from the Tiergarten near Brandenburg Gate and head straight to Bavaria and from there to safety on the other side of the world. Hitler again refused. He was not going to spend his life on the run, not like the others. He thanked...
Man, that's like, we found that out when we watched the movie Downfall. Like, he was loyal to, Germany and, his own Nazi party till the bitter fucking end.
Yeah.
Like, that's just how he was.
Fucking, yeah. So, this is like picking up where that movie ended.
Yeah,
it's like setting the scene right where that scene left us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, okay. All right. It's like the part 2.
Yeah, it's a continuation of the story.
Yeah.
Bauer for his concern and his duty to the fatherland and handed him one of his prized possessions, a portrait of the Prussian King Frederick the Great. And so on that day, sometime in the late afternoon, Bauer was there when Hitler's dead body was wrapped in a blood-stained rug and taken into the garden. Tears filled Bauer's eyes. Just days before, he'd watched his Führer feed nuts to squirrels in that garden. Hitler had been the best man at his wedding, and now he was being doused in gasoline, treated no better than the garbage. On May 1st, Hitler's propaganda chief, the ever-loyal Joseph Goebbels, also became a smoldering mass of flesh and bone in that garden. His wife, Magda, burned next to him. The Soviets would find at least some of their remains. Turned out that the cremation job was a shoddy one. The Soviets, under the ruthless leader Joseph "Man of Steel" Stalin, did not want dead bodies. This was no good. He wanted to capture those top Nazis. Like the USA, the Soviets wanted the scientists. They wanted the spies, the great swaths of German intelligence, the doctors who had medical data no other country had. There were many precious and valuable items among that Berlin rubble, but the real treasure were the Nazis themselves. Bauer did not get that far. The road he planned to use as an airstrip had been bombed and was covered in potholes. Hitler was right not to go. The street was crawling with soldiers from the Soviet Third Shock Army. They found Bauer and shot him in both legs. Not too far away, the Nazi Chancellery head, Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's closest who'd fled at the same time as Bauer, was killed by Soviet artillery. It would be years until Bormann's death was confirmed. For decades, there were rumors about his whereabouts in the South Americas, Denmark, and Australia. It was said he was a Soviet spy, that maybe he and Hitler had teamed up again. The CIA and the FBI never stopped looking for those two guys, which wasn't public knowledge. Of course, it wasn't until 1998 that Bormann, who was one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was conclusively identified using forensic DNA techniques. Every high-ranking Nazi became part of this treasure hunt. The last thing the Americans wanted was for the Soviets to get there first. After one of Bauer's legs was amputated by Soviet doctors in June 1945, he was interrogated time and again. Where is the gold? Where is all the stolen art? Where are your brothers in arms? Where are the scientists? No way would the Soviets kill this man who'd been there at the end of Hitler's life and surely knew where the other Nazis had fled. As newspapers the world over ran headlines about Hitler's death and the peace that was surely on the way, Stalin wasn't buying it. Not for a second did he believe Hitler was dead. The Germans didn't surrender immediately after Hitler perished, but the war was a hopeless cause. Germany at least hoped for some favorable conditions, but they were not going to come. Karl Donitz, the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, replaced Hitler as the head of state and was the one to make the final decision to give up. The Allies would accept nothing but complete unconditional surrender, and that happened on May 7th when Alfred Jodl, the chief staff of the German army, signed it into effect at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force at Reims in northeastern France. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Millions of people had died. Soldiers had returned home with missing limbs. The Soviets, who'd suffered far worse than anyone else, were barely in the mood for the kind of celebration seen elsewhere. 27 million dead, economic chaos. It was terrible for the Soviets, although their propaganda machine played down just how bad the war had been. Stalin didn't even know how close the Americans were to executing the first nuclear bomb test under the Manhattan Project. His dream of world domination diminished the moment his aide whispered in his ear on July 16th that the Americans had completed the test. He was attending.
Wow. Now I'm starting to understand the origins of the Cold War. Basically, it was a rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and started, with them wanting to get the German Nazi scientists for themselves.
Yeah. Was it Werner von Braun? He was I think he was a defector, or we got him in the free agency after the war. But that's where a lot of our missile program, our rocket program wouldn't have existed if it weren't for those last minute pickups, because it was a scramble. It's like, do you turn a blind eye to this terrible past and bring them over for the advancement of science and potential future wars? And that's, like I said, that was in the government's best interest at the time.
Yeah, for world domination. One of either America or Russia was going to dominate the world. And all these years later, we see which one succeeded in that.
Who got the the high valued, I guess, would be executed prisoners of war,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very, very, very gray area. Not for me, but like for a government to do that. Like
Right.
you were the cause of atrocities and war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But we need this shit to go into space.
Yeah. Yeah.
So make it go into space, and congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to your new life. Like,
Yeah.
and it's just
Witness
like,
protection.
dude, it's wild because
Mhm.
both parties, a lot of people were trying to get them to come to their sides to fight for them.
Yeah.
You know?
I just find it interesting, like what you said at the top of the video, how this part really wasn't taught in school. And, it's like they taught about World War II, how it ended, and then right into the Cold War. It's like, what? Wait. There's a missing link there.
Yeah.
Now we get that missing link. At least I have.
It's like, okay, there's a continuation that leads up to the next one.
Yeah.
Like, this is like that it's a transitional scene from one terrible thing to a possible other terrible thing, which was the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that was the gray area.
Yeah.
For a lot of us.
And we didn't get that transitional piece.
Nope.
Mhm.
Attending the Potsdam Conference at the time with the British and American leaders. It suddenly became much more important to find those Germans in hiding. The public didn't know it, but a new secret war featuring spies was taking place between the US, UK, and the Soviets. Take them alive, not dead, was what all three were saying. As you'll see, they did just that, but they didn't feel the need to tell anyone about it. It was capitalism versus communism, and it would be a long fight. Hitler was dead, even if Stalin didn't believe it. Goebbels was surely dead, but what about the other main players? What about Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe? Not long before the end came for Germany, he'd been sentenced to death by Hitler for the alleged crime of attempting to seize control of the state. Bormann had orders to execute him if Berlin fell, which of course was always going to happen. It was better for Göring to surrender to the Americans than give himself up to the Soviets, and that's what he did on May 6th when the 36th Infantry Division of the US Army got hold of him. Göring's lavish tastes for gold, jewels, and art came out in his trial, as did his starring role in the Holocaust. But after being handed the death penalty by hanging, not by firing squad as he'd asked, his life came to an abrupt end in his prison cell. If you'd had to list the top 5 Nazis, including Hitler of course, you might put Bormann in 4th, Goebbels in 3rd, Göring in 2nd, and the top man next to the boss was the head of the SS and Gestapo, the Holocaust's main man, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler had also become the object of Hitler's wrath after he'd attempted to engage in peace talks with the enemy. This infuriated Hitler, who'd always seen Himmler as possibly the most loyal of his inner circle after Goebbels. Hitler called Himmler's call for peace treachery, the worst case of disloyalty in his entire life, and ordered his capture and execution. On May 21st, long after Hitler had been turned to ash, Himmler was apprehended by the British while trying to escape. He was then sent to the 31st Civilian Interrogation Camp outside the city of Lüneburg. Despite the civilian clothes and the absence of his mustache, the British discovered they had someone important on their hands, and no sooner than Himmler admitted that, he was dead. A doctor had asked him to open wide, and the next second, following a slight crunching sound, he was on the floor. Hitler's inner circle was suddenly looking like a quiet place. The man later called the chief architect of the Holocaust, second to Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, had already died in 1942 at the hands of Czech resistance fighters. This left another of Hitler's closest, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, who'd once had ideas he might become Hitler's successor. He was arrested by the British after Germany's surrender. It was heard during the Nuremberg trials that Speer had been a very important component of the Nazi war machine, a literal architect in the industry of mass murder. But it was never certain what he knew about the Nazis' extermination plans, so he only got a 20-year prison sentence. This also left the Nazi Minister of Foreign Affairs Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was arrested in May 1945. After the trials in Nuremberg, he too was sentenced to death. Next up for a death sentence was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command. Hitler's inner circle was now almost emptied, But in the who's who of Nazis, Erich Raeder's name also came up. He'd been the Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine before Dönitz took over the position. He might have kept his job as Hitler's main guy in the Navy had it not been for the embarrassment at the Battle of the Barents Sea, when Britain's Royal Navy delivered a beating to the Germans late at night in the Arctic off the coast of Norway. Raeder lost his job, but
the greatest raid of all time. We saw that.
No, that was I think that they destroyed the port.
The port.
Right? They destroyed the port, I believe.
Yeah, but I somehow, if that wasn't it, it reminded me of that. So, yeah, that's what came to my head at that time.
Didn't mean he was going to get off scot-free at the trials. Nonetheless, he and Dönitz later breathed a sigh of relief in the courtroom when instead of a death sentence, they were just handed prison sentences. Raeder wasn't expecting that since he'd been charged with all the biggies: war crimes, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, planning, initiating crimes against the laws of war, and waging wars of aggression. They threw the book at Dönitz too, but some of the charges didn't stick, and he got away with a 10-year prison sentence. Both men were able to argue they weren't involved in the Holocaust quite convincingly. Those Nazis accused of being a major part of the final solution were not so fortunate to go on to serve prison sentences and in later life write books and then take up gardening. Hans Frank, the Governor General of occupied Poland, was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and no way was he going to get off with a prison term. The so-called Butcher of Poland exhibited no shame during the trial when he said, "I was happy when Adolf Hitler, in a most wonderful rise to power, unparalleled in the history of mankind, succeeded by the end of 1938. Frank was asked, "Did you ever participate in the annihilation of Jews?" He replied, "I say yes, and the reason why I say yes is because, having lived through the 5 months of this trial, and particularly after having heard the testimony of the witness Haas, my conscience does not allow me to throw the responsibility solely on these minor people." Like many Nazis at the trial, Frank didn't want to look like an evil beast, so he passed the hot potato upwards as if everything had been Hitler and Himmler's fault. Hitler must have been rolling in his grave at this point. 6 million Jews dead, Soviet prisoners, other POWs, Roma people, gay people, all dead, and no one wanted to take the blame. They looked like burping children denying they just stole a can of soda. The evidence was overwhelming. Another main man in the Holocaust was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a rabid anti-Semite that used to hang on Hitler's every word when the so-called Jewish problem was brought up. In the opening statements, he was asked if he was aware he was being charged with being one of the people connected to Gestapo terror and the atrocities of the concentration camps. He said he was and accepted that the hatred of the world is directed against me. While his name might not always pop up in conversations when people nowadays talk about Nazis, he was what the people said he was, the monster of the Holocaust. Well, one of them anyway. Still, like the others, he passed the hot potato, stating in the middle of the trial, "I never saw a gas chamber, either in operation or at any other time. I did not know they existed." Like many at the trials, he tried to minimize his part in the mass murders, saying he just followed orders. He was one of 10 men, some of whom we've mentioned already, that was hanged on October 16, 1946, beginning at 1:11 a.m. Precisely at 1:52 a.m., it was Kaltenbrunner's turn. His last words were, "I've done my duty by the laws of my people, and I am sorry my people were led to this time by men who were not soldiers and that crimes were committed of which I had no knowledge." It seems he died throwing that hot potato. 43-year-old Sergeant John C. Woods from San Antonio in the U.S. was the executioner. Despite all this denial, he took great pride in his job. He told Time magazine, "I hanged those 10 Nazis, and I am proud of it. I wasn't nervous. A fellow can't afford to have nerves in this business." Some people who were there said some of the men's heads hit the trapdoor on the way down and that the rope wasn't long enough, so they were strangled to death rather than dying from their necks being broken from the fall. The U.S. Army denied this, but to be frank, not too many people expressed dismay at a possibly half-botched hanging. Rumors circulated that the Army had done this on purpose. These 10 men were perhaps the cream of the crop, but the massacre of millions doesn't happen without thousands of people being involved. The U.S. alone arrested around 100,000 Germans accused of war crimes. There was the Doctors' Trial in 1946, in which 23 men were accused of conducting or taking part in the terrifying Nazi medical experiments we'll discuss soon. 7 men were acquitted and 7 were sentenced to death. The others spent around 10 years in prison. Over 1,300 witnesses came forward to talk about the horrors inflicted in those camps. Over 30,000 documents were brought into evidence, and the proceedings generated around 132,000 pages of transcripts. One of the men featured in those transcripts a lot was Adolf Eichmann. another architect of the Holocaust. This man helped to bring millions of Jews into those camps where they would live in horrific conditions and almost always be exterminated. Eichmann was one of the men that designed the plans for the final solution. He often gave the orders to many of those who would later pass the blame on to anyone but themselves. One of them was Rudolf Höss. The testimony of Höss shocked everyone, and it suddenly made Eichmann one of the most wanted men on the planet. Höss served as the Auschwitz commandant and was one of the people responsible for introducing the pesticide Zyklon B as the weapon to kill millions of people in the gas chambers. He didn't deny it. He also said something that put Mr. Eichmann in deep water. Höss was asked, "Witness, did the state police, as an authority of the Reich, have anything to do with the destruction of the Jews in Auschwitz?" He replied, "Yes, insofar as I received all my orders as to the carrying out of that action from the Obersturmführer, senior assault unit leader, Eichmann." This name popped up time and time again, and to everyone's alarm, he wasn't one of the men about to testify in any trial. He'd done a runner, and as you'll see, he had some help. Höss came right out.
Wow. Wow. It's a little bit of foreshadowing right there of this, fleeing to Argentina or other places. Like, it's going so fast. Like, I'd want to pause, but then when I want to pause it, like, it keeps going. There's a lot of info there.
I feel like this what we're listening to doesn't even begin to scratch the surface.
Yeah.
Yes. Holy crap. 132,000 pages of transcripts? Dude.
Yeah.
Oh my God, man.
Wow. And there was no digital paperwork then. Like, it was all paperwork, and it was like, oh my God. And a point I wanted to make earlier is that, everyone, when they think of the Holocaust and World War II in Germany, automatically they think of Hitler. Like, Hitler was just the tip of the iceberg. He was the figurehead. There was so many people below. The rabbit hole just goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, as we're seeing right here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And even then, that's not scratching the surface.
No. They functioned and they functioned as a diabolical, evil war machine, a machine of destruction and pain.
Yeah.
And that is, everyone knows what everyone has to do. That means everyone is accountable.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's like, you got the, what do they say? Hitler's, his close,
his inner circle.
His inner circle were all basically wiped out. They got a lot of his right-hand man. Right?
Yeah.
Hand, you know what I mean?
Right-hand men. Got the book thrown at them or executed because of that.
Yep. And so then it's like the next layer of the onion. And it's like, dude, I'm surprised they're still not going on now with as many people as that were involved.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Good God, man.
Mm-hmm.
Out with it, explaining in a written statement that he later confirmed in court, "We executed about 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone in Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. He admitted to murdering 20,000 Russian POWs as well as torturing British POWs. He said at Auschwitz they executed 2.5 million people, while 500,000 more died from starvation. Some of the more important words ever written after World War II were in Höss's signed testimony. You need to hear this from the horse's mouth because it is so astonishing. I used Zyklon B, which was a crystallized prussic acid that we dropped into the death chamber from a small opening. It took from 3 to 15 minutes to kill the people in the death chamber, depending on the climactic conditions. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. We usually waited about 1/2 hour before we opened the doors and removed the bodies. After the bodies were removed, our special commandos took off the rings and extracted the gold from the teeth of the corpses. Höss explained how mothers would hide their children in the camp, how he and his men tried to keep the extermination secret from the rest of the prisoners, but the foul and nauseating stench gave it away. In relation to the mass executions, he was asked again, "This entire action came to you directly from Himmler through Eichmann, who had been personally delegated?" He replied, "Yes." So the line of command went Hitler, Himmler, Eichmann. As you now know, Himmler was dead by this point, as was Hitler, so now Eichmann was the man that everyone wanted, that the Jewish people were screaming out for. But
Wow.
Wow.
I'm just still trying to process what it was. Eichmann? Is that what he said? Or whatever, whoever it was that said that the process of, carrying out the I can't even describe it, and I don't want to try and describe it.
That's wild, dude.
Yeah.
That's just wild, man.
That'll give me nightmares for sure.
I mean, god damn. Anyway, Jesus, dude.
Eichmann was nowhere to be found. After the war, he was arrested with other SS officers by U.S. troops and later sent to a work camp. He'd given the U.S. authorities the name Otto Eckmann. By the time Haas was spilling the beans, Eichmann had escaped the camp and was hiding out in Germany under the name Otto Heininger. For those escaped Nazis to survive on the run, they needed a lot of friends. One of them was the Austrian bishop Alois Hundal, a man who years later would refuse to admit he'd done anything wrong, famously saying, "We do not believe in the eye for an eye of the Jew." It was Hundal who made it possible for Eichmann and many other war criminals to hide out in monasteries and Nazi safe houses until they had sufficient paperwork to get a passport and head to Argentina or another far-flung nation. These escape routes were called rat lines. Many of them led to countries in South America, but other chosen destinations were Mexico, Switzerland, and as you'll hear about in detail, the USA. There are various reasons why the Nazis chose South American countries. One is they could find other Germans there. Many of the countries were sympathetic to the Nazi cause. Cruel dictators would take them. There was also the fact that those countries didn't have extradition treaties. And once enough Nazis were in a certain country, they could form networks. A Nazi journalist interviewed Eichmann in 1956. These recordings were not made public until 2022. They tell you a lot about Eichmann, who quite nonchalantly admitted, "I don't care about the Jews deported to Auschwitz, whether they lived or died. It was the Führer's order. Jews who were fit to work would work, and those who weren't would be sent to the final solution." As he said those sobering words, Jewish Nazi hunters were sure Eichmann was somewhere in Argentina. Eichmann had actually settled in well, working various jobs and at one point becoming the department head at a Mercedes-Benz plant in Buenos Aires under the name Clement. Little did the Nazi hunters know that—
Wow. Just assimilated into the local culture, or got a job and,
at Mercedes.
Mercedes, a German.
Got a job at Mercedes. Bro.
That's not inconspicuous at all.
Well, I guess you go where you like. Good God, man! Could you imagine? I mean, oh my God! If you ever have problems with your boss, he's such a Nazi. Like, actually, you're not too far off.
Oh God!
Jesus.
Oh God!
You know what I mean? Like, good God! Oh,
you think your boss is bad?
Jesus, dude.
So I guess this is what fueled the fire that the conspiracy that Hitler didn't die. He just fled to Argentina.
Because there were lots.
Yeah, there were lots of them, and he probably could have blended right in.
Yeah, there were lots. It's crazy. I want to see what else they say about that, because that's, man. Oh my God! It's
I know.
Fucking crazy.
But the CIA already knew that. The CIA even had its own Nazis in South America on its payroll. Many years later, the agency declassified 27,000 documents about former Nazis and their lives on the run. One of the documents reads that Eichmann is reported to have lived in Argentina under the alias Clemens. He was actually living under the name of Ricardo Clement. Why no one told the Nazi hunters is complicated. It's believed that the West Germans and the British also knew much that those Nazi hunters wanted to know. This was the Cold War, and perhaps those countries like the US had a reason for not sharing all their intelligence. You'll understand this more clearly soon. For now, we'll just say some men were supposed to stay hidden. In May 1960, a group of Israeli Mossad agents sent to capture Eichmann staked out his house in San Fernando, a suburb of Buenos Aires. They watched him travel to work and back by bus. They were sure they had the right man. At one point, one of the agents went up to Eichmann and talked to him in Spanish. Eichmann got scared and guessed what was happening. But before he could run, two other agents were wrestling him to the ground. One of the worst runaway monsters of World War II had been captured. This wasn't extradition in any sense of the law, it was kidnapping, but hey, what were they to do without any extradition treaties in place? The agents drugged Eichmann and smuggled him back to Israel on a plane, breaking God knows how many laws on the way. This was incredibly controversial at the time. For an architect of the Nazi genocide, Israel basically said something like, "Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures." Eichmann was soon standing in a courtroom described by one of the 500 journalists as a thin, balding man of 55 who looked more like a bank clerk than a butcher. It was a naive thing to say. Evil doesn't snarl and have horns. It winks and wears a tie. Like the rest, Eichmann denied being the monster he'd been made out to be. He told the court he didn't kill anyone and that he was only dealing with train timetables and technical aspects of evacuation transports. Nope, that didn't impress anyone. He was executed in 1962. When those Mossad agents were in Argentina, they had to make a sacrifice. That's because they might have also been able to capture the man that was known as the Angel of Death, the Nazi doctor that experimented on prisoners in the worst possible way, Joseph Mengele. This is the man that would walk up to Jews after they entered the camp and picked out the specimens he wanted, often the children who would later call him uncle after he handed them candies. Little did they know they were going to be his human guinea pigs. This is how one of those kids later described being picked by Mengele. Dr. Mengele pulled me out of a queue as we were on the way from the sea logger camp to the gas chamber. I was the only one picked that day personally by Mengele and his assistant. They took me to his laboratory where I met other children. They were screaming from pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. On the behalf of the German pharmaceutical companies and the war effort in general, Mengele would purposefully infect people with diseases. He gave some gangrene after rubbing dirt and glass and wounds he'd made. He operated on people without anesthesia. Sometimes when he was done, he ordered them out the back of the lab where they were shot. It's not certain how many people were victims of these terrible experiments, but it was likely in the region of 27,000. It's been reported that over 4,300 of them died, and many more were rendered disabled or left with terrible scars. Lots of them later testified about the horrors they'd faced in the camp. His infinitely unethical work, of course, was useful to the Nazis. In a sane world, you can't experiment on humans, but in the world of war, the Nazi war, that suddenly became possible. Some were left outside to freeze to the point of death and then were dangerously heated up. Women had their muscles and nerves removed. Many had entire limbs hacked off. Some were given deadly blood infections. Dr. Zdenka Nedvedova-Niedla.
Oh my God. Wow. God, it's making me almost queasy thinking about it. I mean, not to the point where I need a barf bucket, but oh my God,
it's like pure evil behind the guise of twisted, effed up science. You know what I mean? It's like, dude, like burn in hell. You know, and
yeah,
what I remember hearing. And so take that for what it's worth. But like one of the reasons they all crumbled so fast and so hard was because of their documentation of what was being done, because they were masters at recording everything.
Yeah,
they were meticulous at keeping records and data and all of it.
Yeah, they were too good at it.
And that was thrown back at them, rightfully so, in the I want to say Nuremberg trials.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, all the
because they got all the proof, dude. All the
proof. Yeah. It was a cakewalk for them to persecute them.
That's crazy.
A Czech doctor who worked alongside Mengele later testified high amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blades or legs were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick injection. It wasn't an easy decision for those Mossad agents to know that they were giving up Mengele in order to catch Eichmann. They'd heard the nightmarish stories, but in that contaminated sea of hidden Nazis, Eichmann was the bigger fish. One of the Mossad agents explained it simply. When I have a bird in my hand, I don't start looking for a bird in the bush. I'll take the bird in my hand, put it in a cage, and then deal with the one in the bush. But by the time the Red Army liberated Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, Mengele was long gone. When the Americans got him in June, he'd already given all his important documents to a nurse. The US had no idea who they had on their hands, so they released him under the name Fritz Ullmann, which he later changed to Fritz Hollmann. He stayed in Germany for a while working on farms, but when those testimonies revealed his sadistic experiments, he managed to persuade enough people he was a worthy candidate for a first-class rat line ticket. SS members helped him get to Italy, where they got a passport from the International Committee of the Red Cross. In 1949, he sailed on a ship to Buenos Aires and later worked as a carpenter under the name of Helmut Gregor. He was being careful for a good reason. A sure death sentence awaited him in Europe. But his confidence grew over the years. He made trips back to Europe to see his family, even going on a skiing holiday. Back in Argentina, he started a pharmaceutical company. He gave young women illegal abortions. He never really changed. Speaking about Brazil, he once wrote in his diary, "Brazil is a nice country to live in despite the mixing of races, but there are many people who, like me, believe and are sympathetic to the Nazi movement and racial ideology." He remained a fan of eugenics, writing in another entry, "Weaker humans should not be permitted to reproduce. This is the only way for humankind to exist and sustain itself." During the trial of Eichmann in 1961, Mengele's name was mentioned numerous times. Later, in 1963, during the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, a witness named Vera Alexander shocked everyone in attendance when she said, "There was a set of twins, gypsies, whom he took away one day from the block where I was. That was the Ziegunterlager, the gypsy camp. Some days later, he returned with them with veins in their arms and their backs sewn together."
Oh.
The judge couldn't believe his ears and asked her again, "He sewed them together like Siamese twins?" She replied, "Yes, he did." Alas, Mr. Mengele was never brought to justice. On February 7, 1979, while Mengele was at a coastal resort in Brazil, he had a stroke in a swimming pool and drowned. He was seen as one of the ones that got away. But little did Americans know that fiends like him were living among them at this time. None of this would have been possible if it wasn't for those rat lines. Franz
79.
1979? Good God, man.
Man. Maybe they learned their lesson in, documenting everything, and they stopped documenting everything.
Holy fuck. That's...
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. Holy shit. So let's see this. My father was born in 1945.
Okay.
All right. No, 1955.
55. Okay.
And he was born in Colombia. So not like that's crazy. Like, dude, that wasn't that long ago. It wasn't that long ago that he died in that swimming pool.
Yeah.
Because that death is more than anyway.
Yeah, and I guess the creepy part is he wasn't too many degrees of separation from Nazis, and I'm pretty sure we may be like with the advent of the internet and the rise of that in the past few years, there are neo-Nazis among us.
Oh yeah,
unfortunately.
But this dude went to Argentina and started a pharmaceutical company. Holy shit, is that terrifying?
Yeah.
Holy shit, is that man? Oh my god.
Mm-hmm. And how he was able to get away with it, at least,
Well, he did until he died.
For a bit, until he died.
But he died in a swimming pool, not in a prison, not by a hanging, not by an execution.
Died in a no justice.
A,
yeah.
Stangl is more proof. He was one of the worst, the commander of the Sobibor and Treblinka extermination camps. It said on his hands was the blood of possibly 1 million Jews. This made him an even bigger fish than Mengele. In 1948, he went to see that man of the cloth, Bishop Aloy Hundal, when Hundal said to him, "You must be Franz Stangl. I've been expecting you." He went first to Syria with the documents Hundal gave him, and later he headed to Brazil. With his family in tow, he worked in Sao Paulo at a Volkswagen car plant. But for once, justice was served and Stangl was extradited. He was back in West Germany in 1967 and he was sentenced to life in prison in 1970. Just 6 months into that sentence, he died from heart failure. He called the Jews he killed mere numbers, cargo, as he said one time. About mass murder, he stated, "That was my profession. I enjoyed it. It fulfilled me. And yes, I was ambitious about it. I won't deny that." One of his last interviews, he told a journalist, "In reality, I share the guilt." 19 hours later, he was dead. Stangl, like many of the rats in the rat lines, crossed the Alps into Italy. They often hid out at the Capuchin monastery near Bressanone, and sometimes the Franciscan monastery near Bolzano. This was called the monastery route. From there, Rome was usually the next destination and then to far-off places. In Rome, with a member of the Catholic Church having confirmed their identity, the International Committee of the Red Cross supplied them with a passport. Somewhere in the region of 120,000 papers were handed out leading up to 1951. This might sound strange, but it was due to humanitarian concerns. The so-called protective passports were for anyone at risk of persecution, including Jews during the Holocaust. Still, the organization was roundly criticized for giving those Nazis papers. This was no time for neutrality, was the usual refrain. Sometimes those involved in the rat lines weren't neutral in the slightest, such as the U.S. intelligence agencies that helped the so-called Butcher of Leon escape. He was Klaus Barbie, a man whose face stayed in his victims' memories for the rest of their lives. The eyes, they used to say, they could never forget his evil eyes. Like a James Bond villain, he interrogated people suspected of being part of the French resistance with a cat in his arms. Survivors testified that he'd put the cat down and walk over to his toolbox, telling them, "You will speak to me. Trust me, you will talk." They all do in the end. One of them later testified, Barbie took pleasure, a pleasure that was astounding in torturing. Another said, he had the eyes of a monster. He was savage. My God, he was savage. It was unimaginable. He butchered them in ways we can't even truly describe, and then sent them to their deaths at the camps. Barbie was the head of the Gestapo in Leon, whose headquarters were at the famed Hotel Terminus. This is where the torture happened, often for days on end with that damn cat of his always nearby. Not many people could hold out. Some did, though, such as a woman named Lise Leserve, whom Barbie thought was connected to a resistance fighter named Dider. On his last attempt to torture her, after already smashing her up and freezing her in baths of ice cubes, he said in a calm voice, "I admire you, but in the end everybody talks. What you have done is magnificent, my dear. Nobody has held out as long as you. It's nearly over now. I'm very upset, but let's finish. Go on, a little effort. Who is Dider?" She said nothing, just looked at him from her swollen eyes with a hatred she never thought she could muster. He then said, "Liquidate her. I don't want to see her anymore." Stories like these were common. It was discovered after the war that Barbie sent possibly 4,000 of those people to extermination camps, including dozens of orphans. This was a man with plenty of information about spies. He had a lot of intelligence in his mind and in his little black books, so after the war, he was a man of great value, a top asset. The British got there first. Their agents beat him and interrogated him, asking him everything he knew, including the names of all the secret communists in Europe. God only knows the US wanted those names more than anyone. In fact, the US took Barbie away from the Brits. A paper written on the matter reads, CIC rationalized that if unemployed, Barbie would renew his overtures to the British, who would find out that the CIC had not turned him in. The U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, an early iteration of the CIA, knew the French wanted Barbie the Butcher to pay for his crimes, but he was just too good to give up. So the CIC put Barbie on their payroll. They said if he spied for them as an anti-communist, he'd live very comfortably and get hundreds of dollars for his work. Well, thought Barbie, that sounds better than hanging from a rope. They also promised him they'd make his name disappear, since word was already getting around about this Butcher of Leon. It wasn't an easy decision for the CIC. They knew the French wanted justice. It was just a matter of thinking about what was better in the greater scheme of things, and the agency chose to keep Barbie. Now, things get really crazy. A now declassified file states in 1951, the CIC sponsored his escape to South America via a rat line operating through Italy. The question is, who did they pay? In actions that many years later the U.S. Justice Department would have to issue apologies over, the CIC enlisted a fascist war criminal who was one of the main instruments of ratline escapes. He was the Croatian priest named Dr. Krunoslav Draganovic, a nasty piece of work said to be behind the murder of hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Serbs and Jews. Here is a part of a secret CIC memo that was decades later unearthed. The 430th CIC detachment has been operating with what they term a rat line evacuation system to Central and South America without serious repercussions during the past 3 years. At the cost of approximately $1,000 for each adult, 430th CIC is transferring evacuees to Italy, where they are provided with legal documentation obtained through devious means there. South American dictators ran a tight ship in terms of capturing and killing their enemies, and Barbie was the king of interrogations. They tortured their critics and made others go missing. Since they were anti-communist, things got the backing of the U.S. under Operation Condor. The U.S. paid for and arranged coups of democratically elected leaders, so relatively speaking, having a Nazi on the payroll wasn't really such a big deal. There's even more circumstantial evidence that it was Barbie and the CIA working in a collaboration that led to Guevara's capture by Bolivian soldiers. We now know that Barbie was also on the payroll of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. He was Agent 43118. Like the US, West Germany would rather not have this come out, but it did. Barbie worked with other organizations that killed indiscriminately and ruled by fear, the drug traffickers. For a while, he helped Bolivia's biggest drug lord Roberto Suarez Gomez, aka the King of Cocaine. He later got pally with Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel. Escobar gave him money for his anti-communist work, which was kind of weird given the US was after Escobar, yet at the same time working with Barbie. It wasn't too long though before his identity was revealed and he was on his way back to Europe to face the music. The spying agencies of the Americans, the Brits, and the West Germans were all somewhat hot under the collar because they'd known all along he was alive and well, working as torturer-in-chief in South America while trafficking drugs. When he arrived at
Wow.
That's a lot that he said right there.
Just makes you confirm what we've said on podcasts before, and that you can't trust these fuckers. You can't trust these governments.
No.
Of course. They don't work with your best interests in mind.
And none of them, guys, none of them do.
No.
That's just how it is.
Yeah, and it's figures on both sides of the aisle, both parties. They're in it for the same thing. And if they, funded all these Nazis, ex-Nazis, and all these drug traffics routes.
Yeah, because think about that. Think about that. What was the latest timeline on him? When did he get outed? Think about how many presidencies came and went while he was still on the run. You know what I mean? How many? And each president gets their little black book of secrets. Guaranteed that was one of them.
Oh yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute, we're paying what? Excuse me?
Yeah.
And then you're just like, we just turn the page. Keep going. Don't worry about that. We don't talk about that.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like no matter what they campaign on, it's not till, during the transition period that the president before them is like, all right, here's that black book. We're doing this thing.
Yep.
And yeah, I had that same look on your face when the previous guy told me that.
Yep. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, here, by the way, we have Nazi on payroll. Bye. And then you're like, wait, what? What did he just say? Like, yeah, you could have stopped that. Any of them, any of the presidents that came before and, well, not before, but after World War II, like this whole thing, when we knew that we had him, and it wasn't just us. There were a lot of people that knew he existed. He still drew breath. So it's like all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not just America. They also said Britain and West Germany also knew that this big old neo-Nazi was the big old ex-Nazi or current Nazi, whatever.
He wasn't still the neo. He was still the OG.
Yeah, he was still drawing breath and was on their payroll.
Oh my God, dude.
At the airport in 1983, a 44-year-old woman who he had tortured as a kid was there and tried to shoot him. She failed and got herself arrested.
Wow.
He was hated that much, so his appearance was mightily embarrassing for the Americans. The Justice Department had to make that apology. Its long investigation led to a paper being written, with sections headed with things like the Army's interest in reactivating Barbie in 1965 to 67, drug trafficking, weapons trade, and Barbie's entries into the United States. While Nazi hunters were struggling to find him and the French were clueless about his whereabouts, the CIA was writing memos that said he could be re-recruited in the late 60s if he could provide unique information of significant importance under secure operational conditions. Barbie went to trial. His victims hissed and screamed at him in the courtroom. Some broke down, describing in harrowing detail what had happened to them back in Leon. Journalists were rendered speechless by what they heard. How this now old man had been the very embodiment of sadism. Barbie's lawyer tried to argue that what Barbie had done was no different from what the Americans did in My Lai in Vietnam, what the French did in Algeria. It didn't work. He was found guilty of crimes against humanity and died 4 years later in prison. The question now was, who else had the CIA and FBI known about all these years? Declassified documents tell us the FBI investigated the possibility of Hitler escaping through a rat line to South America. Some of the 700 FBI documents declassified in 2014 said just that, or at least wrote about the possibility of it happening. One of them states Hitler's reported to be hiding out in the foothills of southern Andes. The file says a meeting took place in Hollywood. A man in that meeting said he was in a group of 4 people who met Hitler and his party when they landed from a submarine in Argentina. More subs arrived carrying around 50 people, including doctors, all part of Hitler's escape party. All kinds of things were coming out, but that didn't mean they were true. The CIA, under Operation Bloodstone, had tried after the war to hire leading former Nazis in hiding so as to recruit them into the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Both J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and Allen Dulles at the CIA were in on this. The New York Times said in a report that about 1,000 Nazi war criminals were hired, and some ended up being given papers to move to the U.S. One case involved a man accused of machine gunning down 60,000 Jews in Lithuania. He was hired by the CIA as a spy and paid $1,700 a year, as well as 2 cartons of cigarettes each month. That was in 1952. In 1956, he was given the green light to emigrate to the U.S. Years later, when the FBI wanted to prosecute him, the CIA stepped in and said they couldn't do that because it would expose them. In 1980, the FBI told the Justice Department to please step aside when the latter said, "We know at least 16 Nazi war criminals are living in the U.S. and working for you." They were FBI informants, giving information to the agency on who in the U.S. had sympathies for the commies. 16 had been hired, but in 1980, only 6 were still on the payroll. The FBI sent a memo to its agents reminding them the most important thing was protecting the confidentiality of such sources of information to the fullest extent possible. One of those undercover agents was SS Officer Otto von Bolschwing. He'd worked under Eichmann and once authored a research paper on how to best terrorize Jewish people. Despite being a war criminal, he was hooked up with the CIC after the war, and later, when he became the CIA, Bolschwing was one of the agency's best European spies. The CIA thanked him in 1954 when it moved him and his family to New York. What the agency said was a reward for his loyal post-war service. Another note admitted that if the Israelis find out and he's exposed as one of Eichmann's main men, it'll be embarrassing to the U.S. The CIA managed to keep the information about his close relationship with Eichmann under wraps for at least a while. Now, they weren't all great spies. The time.
What?
Wow. Goes back to what we said earlier about Nazis being on the payroll through 1980.
And hear me out on this. You know it was rampant over here. Imagine what they got going over there in Russia.
Yeah, we don't even know that.
We both went to grab people to enhance our research and whatever it be.
Do our dirty work.
Do the dirty work. They were our version of the Expendables. Like, hey, by the way, the Mossad's coming after you and they're gonna unalive you. And when that happens, you just know that you deserve the unaliving. You know what I mean? Like, that's crazy. That's but they did that too. But I think they went about it in a very different way. I don't think the Russians they didn't really, it wasn't a choice. You know, it was like, you will do this.
Yeah, and they were a lot better about covering their tracks. They did it before World War II. Basically, yeah.
I mean, Jesus.
I mean, I remember one thing that will stick out for me from world history class is a picture of Joseph Stalin with one of his comrades beside him. And then later on, there was a picture where that comrade was not there. Like, they had that technology back then, not only to edit the picture, but to edit the comrade out.
Yeah, that's what they, pretty much, man. Pretty freaking much. Oh my God.
Times wrote, but many Nazi spies proved inept or worse, declassified security reviews show. Some were deemed habitual liars, confidence men, or embezzlers, and a few even turned out to be Soviet double agents. Who knows, maybe that quiet man next door your grandmother used to talk about was a Nazi war criminal helped through a US-sponsored rat line after the war. It's thought that under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. took in another 1,600 German scientists, some of whom were members or even leaders of the Nazi Party. These weren't hired as spies like the other men, but to do what they'd always done, science. Some became a big part of the Cold War space race. And don't think for a second that the Soviets didn't also employ former Nazi scientists. They put about 2,200 of them on the payroll.
Yep.
According to The Guardian, some Nazis also lived in the UK, and MI6 hired a few. The paper wrote in 2006, most remained in the UK, however, and were granted civilian status. Many married, started families, and by the 1990s, those who survived were British subjects. Gunther Ebeling was the commander of an annihilation squad of the SS in Warsaw, and right after the war, he ended up working for both the British and American spy agencies. His alias for both agencies was Slim. A research paper featuring Slim and other Nazi war criminals hired by the Brits and Americans states, at this time, the British knew Slim was a war criminal. Perhaps this is why they advised one of their own intelligence officers, Mr. Coleman, to drop his personal friendship with him, which had formed during Operation Nursery. Nevertheless, the British ID had been using Slim in coordination with their American colleagues in an anti-Nazi operation codenamed Jersey Cow, which would later develop into the better-known Operation Selection Board. Operation Selection Board consisted of going after 70 ex-Nazis who were part of a right-wing, virulently anti-communist movement. These rabid and dangerous war criminal anti-communists had actually believed that they would get help from the British and Americans since they were so against Stalin. It was later written, fantastic as this idea may seem, it made sense to these people, and they believed that the British and American authorities would accept it. They then decided to make the supreme effort. At the risk of certain imprisonment, if their plan failed, they sent 5 of their leaders to make contact with the authorities, reveal their identities as fugitives, and make their proposition. The paper also states that Klaus Barbie was responsible for the procurement of supplies for the organization and the establishment of an intelligence network throughout the British and American zones. For a while, the agencies played along and told the Nazis they were behind them, that they'd help them set up a new right-wing government so long as they went after the communists. But the agencies hired Slim to help them arrest these Nazi war criminals, as well as the remaining Hitler Youth in Operation Nursery. In one swoop, the Americans and Brits arrested 50 of these Nazis. A book about the matter states, this was the last large organized group of Nazis to be formed in the western zone of Germany. It was completely broken up, its activities were publicized, and its story now serves as a reminder to the German people of the futility of nationalistic actions outside the scope of existing democratic processes now in operation in Germany. A different paper written about Mr. Slim states, evidence suggests the CIC believed he was crucial to the successful completion of Operation Nursery and the breaking up of other Nazi underground organizations. But Slim's story was a common one. The Americans soon started worrying that it would get out that they and the Brits had a war criminal on their secret books. More concerning was the fact that Slim now knew way too much about American and British intelligence. What if he became a double agent? He soon became a security risk. It was said that the agencies loved the information and not the informant. The spies were highly expendable. 3 British intelligence officers later tried to arrest Slim. As the saying goes, they were bringing him in. The report says Slim's rendezvous on January 18th was a trap. It says the 6'6" huge man went through the Brits like a bowling ball. The report adds they'd been ordered to take him alive and did not in consequence use their pistols except to try to overawe him. One officer shot Slim in the foot and he apparently went berserk, so they tried to knock him out with chloroform. The report states finally after a severe struggle, one of them hit Slim over the head with a loaded stick and knocked him unconscious. They shoved him in a car, pending advice from the Americans, but before they could get him to the Americans, he died in the back. We imagine his last words were something like, "You double-crossing, lying pieces of shh." If this story proves anything, it's that the end of the war was certainly a murky business. Now you need to watch the full version of how they finally caught the Nazi butcher, or have
Maybe we'll get to that next time.
God, that's just juicy, man. As the older I get, the more involved I get with World War II.
Yeah.
I'm about it, man. It's just like, ooh.
Yeah. It's yeah. I guess I'm getting to that level too.
I feel like, as I'm getting older and I'm realizing more and more that what I've been taught wasn't expanded on, or it's just right up, just regurgitation.
Yeah.
Right.
It was just a set of facts that the purpose wasn't to take it in and apply it to your worldview to not make the same mistakes again. It was, in order to pass a test and do the
Yep.
same thing repeatedly over and over again. It's a very interesting subject. Like I said earlier, I now have that missing link that I never had when it comes to World War II, jumping from the end of the war to the Cold War. Now I have that. And
You're just like, oh,
yeah.
oh, that wasn't the end of the Nazis. And you're like, how could it have been? There were tons.
Yeah, and
So
the ones that weren't killed were actually quite protected by a combination of the U.S., the West Germany, and
Russia.
all of Russia and South America, all of South America.
It's crazy. It's just like, oh my God, what an interesting rabbit hole. Like, because that's like the top organizations knew, but the population put the war to bed.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa, far from it.
Yeah, there was a lot more.
Far from it.
A lot more that we don't know and probably will never know.
No.
Yeah, will we ever know if Hitler actually did escape Germany and go to Argentina?
That's the thing. So it's just like, do we? Will we? Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? At this point, I'm pretty sure if he didn't die then, he is beyond dead now. Just out of sheer old age.
Yeah, old age. Yeah.
If he didn't, and let's say he escaped and lived a long life, I hate saying the words. He is in the ground now.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, man, it just poses so many questions, and it's like, dude, everyone knew what was going on, but everyone didn't know.
Yeah, I predict that this is not the last time we're going to visit this subject on the channel.
No.
Yeah.
I am so for this. It's so interesting to me. It's because what we're taught here is like the tip of an iceberg, this Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Like you said, we study in school to pass the test, not to learn.
Right. It's to how to do the same thing over and over again and to somewhat socialize.
Yep.
That's all it's made for. But, infographics, we're thankful that y'all are here. I don't know.
I know, of course. The thing is, like, yes, because this shit happened.
Yeah.
And
it needs to be talked about.
Yeah. The fact that we're learning this so late is a travesty.
Yeah.
Fuck. This would have woken me up in history class.
Yeah.
Seriously. This, I'm like, oh, shit, what? That's crazy.
But then again, some Karen mommy be like, why are you torturing my child with this?
Yeah, true. Very true. No, that's very true.
That's why we're thankful for infographics.
Yep. I'm very. Yeah. I second that, Spence. History, there's no place in history for sensitivity. That's for damn sure. If history's proven anything, sensitivity can get the fuck out.
Exactly.
It's just just
live in reality.
Look at what's happened. Yeah.
100%. Anyway, y'all, thanks for watching. So around and subscribe, watch another video. Wash your hands, scrub your toes, wipe your ass, blow your nose, embrace the suck.
Unplug and do something epic, guys.
See y'all next time.
Fellas, we could be that mistake. Let's do this.